Hey legends, and welcome back to the least knowledgeable sim racing channel. Automobilista 2 went into public early access on March 31st, 2020. It was featured very heavily on this channel during that time, and I owe a great amount of the channel's success to it. What excited me most about the prospect of another potentially high-tier simulator entering the market is the hope that we could get something to bridge the gap between two of my favorite present-day simulators, Assetto Corsa Competizione and rFactor 2. My hope was that AMS2 would eventually bridge the dynamic, interactive physics model of rFactor 2 with the ease of use and graphical and oral fidelity of ACC. I was totally psyched for it to become the best of both worlds. A little over a year later, it has yet to live up to those expectations. In fact, it has yet to even make notable strides toward them. You've likely noticed that since the full release of the game last year, over the last several months, the sim has barely been featured on this channel. The reason for that is that, quite honestly, unless I'm doing a specific review piece, I never find myself driving nor wanting to drive in it. The Steam figures and empty public servers speak to the reality that many of you are likely in the same boat. So, why was one of the most promising new sims to the market largely laid to the wayside by our sim racers? In this video, we'll take a look back over the last year worth of development, where AMS2 has come from, what it's developed on, where we are right now, and also what we can perhaps look forward to in the future. If you enjoy content like this and find yourself making it to the end of the video, consider hitting subscribe to stay up to date about future video releases. Also, it'd really make me like you a lot. In a platonic way, of course. As one of the channels that really hyped up the rise of AMS2, I feel obligated to put this into context. AMS2 was the wave that I rode in order to repivot this channel back towards sim racing. Their update schedule was rapid, and it provided a lot of organic content to cover in quick succession. One of the most exciting things about AMS2 was the rate at which it was being developed on and added to. With the slow-moving behemoth rFactor 2 being my favourite sim at the time, it felt like a breath of fresh air to see developers really cranking out the content and physics updates. Ironically, it's the same rapid update schedule which would turn out to be one of the most frustrating things about featuring the game long-term. See, that update schedule didn't let up after the game hit its full 1.0 release in mid-2020. In fact, the 1.0 release just felt like another minor stepping stone like the dozens before it. The game still had a plethora of issues to overcome, ranging from disparate content through to lackluster multiplayer environments and a whole host of physics issues it inherited with the Madness engine. Over the following months, they promised and executed on a whole heap of licensed content to the likes of GT3 and GT4 cars, classic open wheelers, Group C cars, a bunch of requested tracks, and much more. If there's one thing that Reza can't be criticised for with AMS2, it's their desire to populate their sim with content. As much as this is highly laudable, one of the drawbacks of said content is that instead of fortifying the classes and racing opportunities in AMS2, it just served to make them yet more disparate. There are so many classes and so many niche racing disciplines represented in AMS2 that there's barely any chance to focus on a direction and hammer it down. In contrast to ACC, which has spent years locking down the experience of driving only GT cars and becoming the best-in-class sim for them, AMS2 is perhaps the complete opposite. Tons of open-ended choice, with no structure behind it to unify people and get them racing each other. This has been very clear since the outset with AMS2's very sparsely populated lobbies. It's almost as if, with the Madness engine's locked-off modding support, they're attempting to overcompensate and fill the game with the content that the community would naturally add to open platform sims. The driving experience in AMS2 has been patchy since the outset. Certain open-wheelers and prototype cars were extremely fun to drive and had very detailed communicative force feedback. The tin-top cars, on the other hand, were a little wonky to say the least. In fact, the game released to early access with major damper issues on said cars, causing them to flip on a dime and requiring a big rewrite shortly after release. The way the sim handled grip loss was generally fun but simplified. As a result, it was very engaging to drive certain cars on the limit, but always had that tinge of simcade offered by the Madness engine. Our hope was that over time, Reza would overcome those elements and bring the physics experience closer to that of ACC and rFactor 2. One of the more frustrating elements of covering AMS2's development for months was in realizing that many updates would set the sim back as much as they moved it forward. After several reiterations of the force feedback engine, it's hard to say what's been improved and what's been detrimented. In their race to release updates prolifically, Reza would often regress the game as much as they would improve it. This became especially frustrating from a reviewer's point of view because certain things I'd state could become invalid as soon as a week later with another hotfix. The game was in such a state of flux that I actually rejected outside opportunities to feature it for other channels because I felt so little confidence in what was there actually remaining there in order for the information to remain relevant to the audience. Further, whenever I'd attempt to set up a feature of AMS2 on the channel in subsequent months, it would almost always be derailed by some braking issue, whether it be extremely vague brake feel and the tendency for the car to rear over in a bizarre way, through to the AI systemically murdering me on multi-lap races. During this time, interest in the title began to waver, and I realized that the features weren't all that in demand by the community anyway, so I transitioned over to covering different content. Ultimately, there are only so many times you can repackage the title, AMS2 revamps force feedback. One of the most ironic and somewhat frustrating elements about all of this is that AMS2 is by far the easiest proper simulator to organize private races in. No dedicated server required, you can quite literally just create a private lobby from within the menu, invite your friends, and Bob's your uncle. This led to many a race being organised among myself and friends simply out of sheer convenience. Unfortunately, after many of us realised we preferred even the handling feel of the original Assetto Corsa, we quickly moved on. The game is currently in an interesting predicament. As I say this, there are 325 players concurrently playing it on Steam. This is during a peak time. The off-peak periods dipped down to below 60 concurrent players. The all-time player peak was just over 1,000, and that took place 13 months ago, before the game had even hit full release. In spite of the developers rushing out tons of licensed cars across different categories and various tracks out as DLCs, the numbers tell a bleak tale. Rather than hammering on about spotty physics and all the various issues which have kept me at bay from trying the sim again, I instead would like to take the time to delve into what potentially happened here and why. One of the main drawcards to the original Automobilista was its very unique Brazilian content. While such offerings would always remain niche in the West, it did create a very defined player base. These players also enjoyed some great physics, courtesy of the original rFactor engine, and some widely touted amazing AI. Automobilista 2 decided to go in a slightly different direction. By building on Slightly Mad Studios' Madness engine, Reza had made a trade-off. The solid physics base of AMS1 was now ditched in favour of something more experimental. The AI programming, which AMS2 still struggles with almost a year after full release, also delineated from what their core player base expected. What they gained was a more modern, integrated engine which could potentially look amazing and is likely far more scalable than the aged engine AMS1 was built on. Their first insight lay in porting over much of the content from AMS1 into this new engine to form the vanilla content base of AMS2. This was all good and well, strategically, but it relied on the presumption that they could get the driving experience up to par with the original. With the subsequent paddling they received by major YouTubers such as Jimmy Broadbent, it became obvious that they undershot this goal. Sim racers, after all, are not like regular gamers. You can't simplify the driving experience, then cover it up with a really pretty veneer in order to push through a new product. One of the most popular comments I would receive in the early days, whenever I would compliment AMS2 on any aspect of its handling would be, "Have you actually driven this car in the original?" So, to get my business owner hat on, they were unsuccessful in converting their established base over to the new product. As a result, they had to try to open the net and bring in a wider crowd. This led to the licensing of a bunch of cars from old school DTM through to the ever ubiquitous modern GT cars. However, in their scramble to cater to everyone with everything, the sim began to lose the forest for the trees. Ultimately, the core driving experience of the sim never really competed with the big boys, nor with its own prequel. You can't build a house on shoddy foundations. Let's put it in these terms. In 2021, if you wanted niche Brazilian racing content on a well-rounded, stress-tested sim, you would still opt for the original AMS. If you wanted to drive strictly GT cars, you'd be doing that in ACC. If you wanted to drive multi-class endurance races on meticulously scanned tracks, you'd be doing that in rFactor 2. If you wanted to drive road cars, go drifting, race open wheelers, or just about anything else you could think of, you'd be doing that in the original AC. If you wanted a strictly curated online racing environment with clear-cut progression and regular scheduled races, you'd be doing that in iRacing. So that leaves us with AMS2. A sim that came along but forgot to carve out a market for itself. Ultimately, for just about any racing you could think of, there's another sim you would reach for before AMS2, and this is clearly reflected in the player counts. What baffles me more than anything is that Reza appear to have just stayed the course in spite of this reality. There doesn't appear to have been a concerted effort to double down on any of the classes offered in order to flesh them out, and the physics updates still trickle out sporadically without any fundamental, major overhaul to how the cars handle. Further, there have been next to no developments in the multiplayer situation to entice players to persistently engage each other online and build a stronger racing community around the sim. On a personal level, I realized that I had no real incentive to purchase the DLC content unless I were planning to feature it on the channel. I had no plans to drive it in my own time, nor did I have any plans to organize races with friends or the community using that content. As a developer in a niche genre, which relies on loyalty and strong community in order to remain profitable, this isn't a great position to be in. AMS2 is seen as a sim that's great for immersion. By that, we generally mean the crossover between graphical fidelity, lighting effects, VR performance, and to some extent the actual driving experience itself. Immersion, while a great basis, is not strong enough to carry a simulator to the top. Niche genres live and die by the strength of their communities, and unless something is done to entice the community back to AMS2, it's hard to picture a future with it at the head of the pack. This doesn't necessarily need to spell the end, however. Anybody who can recall the early days of ACC knows how rough Kunos had it during the first year of release. Concurrent player counts were way down, and many of us had written the sim off almost entirely. But after months, which turned into years of consistent development, they managed to overcome the hurdles they faced and build the industry's de facto GT simulator. By many accounts, they faced some unique challenges by building on Unreal Engine 4, which are not unlike the challenges being faced by Reza with the Madness engine. The key thing is for Reza to isolate what needs to be done and to carve out a very specific niche of the market for their sim. These constant releases of disparate content need to stop. There's no point putting out new cars if there's nobody there to drive them. People are ultimately after an experience they can't get anywhere else, rather than just a barrage of content which may or may not drive anything like the real-life counterparts. There has to be a concerted effort back toward the physics core. The cars which are already in the sim need to be dialed in and drive at a level which is competitive with, if not slightly excels that of any other competing sims. If someone would rather reach for GT cars in ACC, then there's barely any reason for them to exist in AMS2 at all. Ultimately, Reza is better off focusing on the content not as well explored by other sims before attempting to compete directly with them. Its focus on prototypes and open wheelers is its dominant strength. Many F1 drivers turned sim racers still use the original Assetto Corsa for driving open wheelers, a game released in 2014. That's a massive opening in the market to plug. Knuckling down and creating the most realistic open wheeler experience, combined with curating an online environment for tiered league races with safety ratings and other persistent systems, would be a way to actually create something unique, something to build a player base around. At a certain point, there has to be a commitment to a direction. There has to be invested research done on various subsystems in the sim, an acknowledgement that a given update is going to be better, and a desire to stay the course on that path rather than constantly tweaking back and forth. As a content creator, I struggle to comment on any systems in the game because they're so liable to change at any moment. Yet unless those changes are always distinctly positive, is there really any point to them being made so frequently? To give an example, no change made to Automobilista 2 at any point was quite as revolutionary and impactful as ACC's jump from a single point time model to a 5.1. That's ultimately what Automobilista 2 really needs. Its own metaphoric jump to the 5-point time model. Anyhow, that's just my perspective on the situation as somebody who closely covered the title since early access. If it happens to mirror your own, I'd greatly appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel. You're one of the few who make it to the end of videos, and that by default makes you my favorite kind of viewer because you make creating all of this content worthwhile. If you didn't like the video, that's absolutely fine. Just hit that dislike twice and show me who's boss. Until next time, I'll see you guys later.